Ladies and gentlemen, we do not reward murderers for the crimes they commit against their fellow citizens. We do not give them wealth in the hope that they will use it to compensate the families of their victims. Nor should we blindly hope that the worst murderers, rapists, and oppressors of all will willingly renounce their crimes against humanity and join the likes of Mother Teresa when we shower them with riches in the form of aid. Definitionally, today's debate is about aid given to dictatorial governments. We say no to Western governments giving aid to dictatorial governments, or any other governments giving aid to dictatorial governments for that matter. We say no to NGOs giving aid directly to the governments of dictatorial regimes. And we say no to the United Nations giving dictatorial regimes aid. What today's debate is not about is aid given directly to the people of these nations by a non-governmental organization operating without the consent of that dictatorship and not complicit with that dictatorship. No, thank you. We say today's debate is not about aid drops conducted against the will of that government, it is not about supporting refugees, and it is not about aid workers like the Red Cross who independently enter that country to help its people. We are going to show you that giving aid to dictatorial regimes is wrong because it consolidates and perpetuates the power of oppressive dictatorships. We're going to show this to you in 5 substantive points. First, that aid only strengthens the dictator's grip on power and doesn't actually reach people it's meant to help. Second, that it is morally abhorrent to fund the human rights violations that these dictators commit. Third, that withholding aid increases the international community's leverage for productive engagement. Yes, sir.
Do you agree that when you suspend this aid, people will get hurt? Because roads will not be built, hospitals will not be built, and schools will not be built.
We concede that some people will not receive all the aid they currently receive, but what we say is that a lot more than people, dictatorships will be weakened, dictatorships will be hurt, and this will be much better in the long run, ladies and gentlemen, and that will help people on the whole. No, thank you. My second speaker review will be making 2 points. First, that international aid sends tacit support for oppressive regimes, and finally, that giving aid to dictatorial regimes prevents aid from being used more productively in all the other places where it could be used in that way. No, thank you, sir. But before I get on to the substantive case, I'd like to make 2 things perfectly clear about the nature of this aid and of the dictatorships to whom it is given. Firstly, the majority of this aid given directly to governments is cash. Some is food, but the majority is cash which goes unconditionally to these governments regardless.
Sir.
The second thing, no thank you sir, is that dictatorships by nature do not have majority support, or else they would not need to be dictatorships. These are oppressive regimes which are not operating in the support of human rights that we are talking about. That brings me on to my first substantive point, which is that international aid strengthens dictatorships and does not help those suffering. And I'm going to show you that the outright benefit of our model is that we weaken the grip dictatorships have on power, making it more likely that their reign will end, and also we don't have a hugely negative impact on most people. Yes, sir?
If the end goal of your policy is to help the people of a nation, why are you denying them the aid that they can use to better themselves?
Because most aid does not get given to them. Most aid is misappropriated by dictators to support their regimes and to further oppress those people and maintain the power of those dictatorships. So, there are 3 reasons why we see that this benefit comes from our model. Firstly, because the majority of this aid that is given to governments does not go to people. Most of it, things like hospitals, are used as military hospitals. Infrastructure is used to support the oppressive military, ladies and gentlemen, like we see in places like North Korea, like we see in places like Burma. And furthermore, we see that this only strengthens the ability, no thank you sir, that the dictators have to oppress their people. But furthermore, and this is the second reason why, is because this actually gives material support to governments. For one reason thing, it gives them money with which they can use to buy the means necessary to oppress their people. And furthermore, when it is not direct cash aid they're being given, what it does do is it gives them something they can sell in order to gain that money to oppress their people. Even infrastructure, as said, can be used in an oppressive way, as I just explained. And this just creates worse oppression for the people. It makes their conditions worse. Worse, no thank you. For every person the aid reaches, more people are oppressed by the guns the aid buys. And finally, what we see is it garners internal political support, because people are brainwashed or tricked into thinking that the aid is provided by the government itself, and furthermore, governments are able to say, we will only feed you, no thank you, if you support us. We will only give you this aid if you support us. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a horrible choice, because these people's freedom should not be for sale. So let's look at examples of this. In 1991, the warlords of Somaliland ran a dictatorial regime. They were given aid both in the form of food and wealth, and 85% of that they traded for weapons with China, which they used to repress the people of Somalia up to this present day, ladies and gentlemen. Furthermore, we said in Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe only gives aid to people who support his government, and that is hugely damaging to the facilitation of a democratic regime in the future. So thus I've shown you that our model weakens these regimes, makes it more likely for regime change, and makes it harder for them to oppress their people. That brings me on to my second substantive argument, which is that it is morally abhorrent to fund human rights violations. And we see that the international community needs to take, no thank you sir, a strong line, an absolute line in this case, saying that it's okay, it's not okay to be a dictatorship. And as we have established, this debate is about distributing aid through a regime. So how does taking a consistent stance make the message that we send morally better? Well, firstly, it does not reward dictatorships the more they oppress their people. No thank you. Currently, the more the people of a nation are oppressed, the worse off they are, the more aid we give their governments. This actually creates an incentive for dictators to actually oppress their people more, and that is horrible. But furthermore, we see that this destroys the precedent and disincentivizes dictatorship. And finally, we say it is wrong to recognize the sovereignty of these dictatorships by directly giving them aid and prop them up, ladies and gentlemen. We do not negotiate with terrorists, and this is completely analogous to that. We should not give dictatorships this aid. And that brings me on to my final substantive point, which is that withholding aid increases leverage for change to the international community. You see, the key benefit of this is that we make it more effective to overturn dictatorships in the long run, not only internally, as I've said before, but also externally. Firstly, because we make sanctions on trade more effective, because as long as we continue to give aid, trade sanctions are completely ineffectual, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, we give more legitimacy to moderates within that regime who wish to negotiate with the international community, who wish to make it a democracy, because the people in that country will in fact support them more. And furthermore, this is a direct attack on the political influence and legitimacy of that government, which helps undermine their strength. And finally, this stops the support from some nations under the guise of aid. Like we see that North Korea is being supported by China. If we stop all political aid, then no longer will the aid China gives undermine the six-party talks. Similarly with Cuba and Venezuela. So what have I shown you, ladies and gentlemen? I've shown you that our model weakens dictatorships both internally and externally and is morally right. The motion stands.
Team New Zealand is a forgetful team. They are forgetful because they forget what aid was meant for. They forget the people who we are trying to help. And they forget that cutting off aid to any nation who needs it is what's morally abhorrent, because it's what pushes the people who suffer in these nations further and further into the depths of poverty. I have 3 points of contention. But before that, I want to tell you what the policy of Team Opposition is. We would give developmental aid to dictatorships. We think this aid can come in terms of money and cash. We think it can also come in terms of objects and in terms of resources that these governments can use. This aid is not going to be conditioned on political change, but we say that this aid can be conditioned on things like corruption and whether or not this aid reaches the people. We tell you this aid can be conditioned on first world governments having some oversight over where this aid goes. We tell you this is standard operating procedure in the way international aid is offered in our world today, and if they dare tell us otherwise, we're going to tell you they're lying to you, ladies and gentlemen. My 3 points of contention are very clear. First of all, I'm going to deal with how we strengthen the grip of dictatorial regimes and how that's wrong, how they accuse us of being morally abhorrent, and that's untrue. And lastly, how they create productive engagement by trying to ridicule dictatorships and by forcing them away from the international scene. So let's talk about this idea of strengthening the grid. Now we tell you, they assert to us that the majority of aid will not go to the people. I tell you, we reject this. This is not true. Currently, aid can reach the people with the appropriate checks on corruption in place that first world governments put on aid all the time. We tell you that even if some of this aid goes to the dictator, we tell you that this is still acceptable. Why? Because some aid going to the people is better than none. This debate is a comparison. On their side of the house, there is no aid going to the people. On our side of the house, at least some of it gets through, and that goes towards improving their lives. No thank you, sir. We tell you that when you don't give dictatorships the aid that they want and need, you only give them the potential to demean our democracy and to say that the Western world and first world nations are not doing enough to help us. We tell you, no thank you, sir, that they are only making it easier for dictatorships to oppress their people by giving them the fire for their rhetoric. Second point of contention on this idea of moral abhorrence. Now, first of all, ladies and gentlemen, they tell us that we create an incentive for dictators to further oppress their people. Untrue. Why is this the case? Because the more aid we give is not conditioned on how oppressed your people actually are. We increase the amount of aid because of how amenable to change you are, because of how much you're willing to talk to us. This is how we create the incentive for even more aid to go to the people. No thank you, madam. In fact, we think that because their premise is wrong, this argument's false. Further, they isolate dictatorial regimes, and this makes it only less amenable to change. Go ahead.
When Somaliland was given aid in 1991, 85% of that aid was used to buy weapons which were used to continually oppress the people.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. We condemn China for doing that. Second, we think checks should have been stronger. You haven't proved to me in principle why those checks cannot work. My final point of contention on how they want to make diplomatic relations more productive. Now, the end point of their argument is that they want to strengthen sanctions. We think sanctions are bad in this case, because sanctions, especially economic ones, are only going to hurt the people on the ground more. These are the people we should be caring about and helping, and they don't seem to care. If we stopped aid, ladies and gentlemen, I'm taking the example of North Korea here, North Korea would not have even come to the six-party talks. We'd have a nuclear war on our hands because North Korea would not even be talking to us if we did not give them aid. They only make things worse. We're going to prove to you today that people should not be punished for the sins of their government. And we'll do this through three arguments, no matter. First, I'm going to be talking to you about the horrors of the proposition's collective punishment. Second, I'm going to be discussing creating constructive engagement. My second speaker, Teoh, is going to be dealing with the long term and how this creates sustainable democracy. So let's talk about the horror of New Zealand's collective punishment. The people in these nations did not choose their government. This government is in power not through the choice or the fault of this particular people. Yet Team New Zealand wants to punish these groups of people twice over. They're not only living under a dictatorship, they also want to deny them the funds they need for economic upliftment. This is because developmental aid is necessary for economic prosperity. It builds roads, it builds schools, no thank you madam, it helps people uplift themselves. The World Bank gave Suharto's dictatorship in the 1970s funds to clean up squatters and sewage systems all over Indonesia. Suharto didn't waste this money away just because he was a dictator. He also reduced the rates of cholera in Indonesia by half. We tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that's a positive thing, and we want more of that. We tell you developmental aid sets in motion the conditions for trade and foreign investment that directly improves the lives of people, but she would disagree.
Can you explain why Ross regarded his more incentive to build a school when he could just build a bigger palace or buy more guns?
You're really not listening to me, madam. We've already told you that we're going to put in place checks. You need to prove to me why in every circumstance these checks will fail. We tell you they failed before in the past does not mean that principally the checks themselves fail. You need to deal with that logic. No thank you, sir. We tell you that Team New Zealand will deny political change and economic upliftment to people. We say no to this. We will still give development aid so that at least some of it filters down to the people. This will happen in our model because first of all, corruption checks can be effective. That's what happened with Suharto in the 1970s when the World Bank gave him money, as I just explained. claim, but we tell you that even if we lose some of the money to the dictator, most of it will still get to the people, and some is always better than none. No thank you. So I've established why developmental aid improves the lives of the people. My second substantive deals with creating constructive engagement. International aid is a powerful force for change. We completely agree. But we use international aid on side opposition in a far more nuanced manner than Team Proposition can do. We ask, what is the calculus of the dictator? The dictator has a siege mentality. He's threatened, he's frightened. Saying we're going to cut off aid unless you dissolve your government makes him feel even more threatened. He withdraws into himself. When you give aid to the dictator, you open up his administration to discussion. He's more amenable to steady changes that can make the lives of his people better in the short and the medium term. This is what happened in Myanmar. The whole world turned their back on Myanmar and said, we reject you. But what did ASEAN do? ASEAN said, no, we're going to talk to you, we're going to keep the lines of communication and constructive engagement open. And we managed to get Myanmar to open their borders to aid when Cyclone Nargis hit Myanmar. We also managed to get them involved in rewriting a new constitution. We say, ladies and gentlemen, we better allow for constructive engagement and we help the people what aid was meant for. Go with opposition. To the starving children in Zimbabwe, Proposition would say, Mugabe's a bad man, I'm sorry, continue starving. To the people in Somalia, because your government wanted to buy weapons, never mind, go on, starve. That's what they're telling you. Because your government was evil, because your government is sinful, your people are punished. That is disgusting, and we cannot stand for it. I have two main points of contention, and I'll expose it to you how exactly their case does not help anyone at all. Now, the first question I'm going to ask is, will aid actually help people? And second question I'm going to ask is, will they advocate some kind of democratic change in dictatorial regimes? First of all, will aid help the people? Now, Mariah came up and said, we made a concession because we said no conditions, but somehow put in a different condition. Let's explain again what our policy actually means. The condition we're putting in place right now is to say that corruption cannot be a measure that your aid will go to the people who need it most. In other words, they have to actually engage with the core logic of what this mechanism means. Our mechanism says that if you want the money, then you make sure at least it goes to building roads, goes to building schools, goes to building hospitals. They haven't shown exactly how these checks will fail, aside from saying, hey, we can't regulate. It's basically sending people to check. Well, if you think about it for a little while, why can't we send international envoys in on the ground to make sure that these projects are going underway, to evaluate whether or not we'll continue supplying this country with aid? They haven't actually understood our policy here. They go on to say, that people will get hurt because countries buy weapons, continue gunning the people down. Why can't we put in place an arms embargo in this case? If you really think that the real fear here is weapons going into a country, then you can tell China, you can tell Russia, stop sending weapons into Somalia. More importantly, they confuse the delineation of between what an economic sanction is and what an arms embargo is. An economic sanction means the people get poorer and poorer and poorer and poorer. An arms embargo means the government doesn't have arms to kill anyone. That's the fundamental difference. They go on to say, no, China and Russia want to prop up dictatorships. Funnily enough, they can tell these countries to stop giving international aid to dictatorships. Why can't you tell them to stop selling arms? Their case doesn't make any sense in this case. They move on to argue that dictators will, misuse aid. First of all, again, they haven't really answered any of my first biggest questions, How come, in principle, these checks are going to fail? How come we cannot make sure that dictators use this money at least on a modicum of living standards for the people? Think about it for a moment also. If some of the money is somehow stolen by a dictator, compare the two models. One side that says, we're not going to give them any money at all, or one side that says, Robert Mugabe may build a house, but at the same time he is mandated by the international community to build schools for the people. Hang on, man. We believe in this case that if Zimbabwe's economy is completely propped up by international aid, you don't want to suspend it and make the people suffer at the expense of some kind of moral ideal. Sir, a man?
If you have so much power over these governments, you can control how they spend every dollar they have. Why don't we have enough power to overthrow them?
Madam,
because overthrowing them means invasion. Because if you think about it for a little while, in this case, the dictator wants control. What we're doing there is achieving a balance. If a dictator says, I want some kind of control over the money that I have, in this case, we're saying we balance. We give you control, but at the same time, you benefit your people in the way that we ask for. They go on to a second substantive point and say we reduce aid to other countries. No, thank you. But think about it. First of all, most of the poor are living in dictatorships right now. More importantly, the implication of their statement here is that some lives are worth less than others because their government is evil. Is that really what we want to stand for? Is that a principle that we can appreciate in today's debate? No. Let's move on to the next question we have to do. Will we change regimes in today's debate? Now, all we've been saying is we want people to change, we want Western governments to facilitate change in the country. In other words, they want to propose revolution. And it sounds a little bit like their case, is waiting for people to starve so badly that eventually they're going to revolt, eventually they're going to get shot to death again. Is that really what we want to see from their side of the house? No. They say Western governments will lose their moral currency in our money. And their examples are the Iranian Revolution, which was inherently multicultural because countries were supplying them with weapons. And then they raised the example of Cuba, where because the people were so badly mistreated by a country that was economically sanctioned, they left the nation. Think for a moment, if they want to stop the people from becoming radical, what is the message they're sending? If a country, if the Western world decides to ignore your country, leave your country to continue starving, you're giving them even more rhetoric, thank you madam, to say, these people have left us alone to die, and it was all their fault. Their attitude is one that's fundamentally imperialist because they want to force change upon people and demonize the governments that want to help. More importantly, they haven't engaged our core logic about how you're isolating countries, thank you madam, and cannot at all engage them, put in checks, put in different kinds of changes to make sure that the country is at least in tune with the international community that they engage and not be put out of the picture where they become another North Korea, another Iran, another threat to world security. No, thank you. I'll move on, in fact, to show you how exactly, if democracy eventually does come about, we're going to create a sustainable system. No, thank you, sir. The thesis for this point is that our system establishes the basis upon which a sustainable democracy is created when it does eventually emerge. The first premise for this point is that international aid goes into a country to sustain and develop people and their country's living conditions. No. It goes a long way, therefore, towards helping a country break out of their poverty. No, thank you. There is no more struggle just to survive, no more struggle just to find food, just to find water. A prime example of this is how development aid goes to the Dominican Republic, listed from 79th in the world to 26th in the UN Poverty Index, propelling its growth in GDP to 8.3% last year. No, thank you, man. So the second premise for this point, therefore, is that we are gradually creating a middle class and a populace that does not need to live a mere shadow of an existence. This develops them to a stage where they are therefore able and willing to challenge governmental authority and rise to the reins of national control. Sir?
Do you honestly believe that nations like China and Russia will do exactly what you say and impose these conditions on dictatorships?
Thank you, sir. If you can tell China and Russia to stop giving aid to North Korea or to Myanmar, then you can jolly well tell them to put in some kind of checks and balances when they indeed do. Your point doesn't make sense with what you propose in your case. So coming back to my point, I think that in this case, because we have already fulfilled the most basic needs of survival, we are creating the basis for a sustainable democracy. One, because your populace becomes more educated, because your vote becomes more informed. And second of all, because people want to move beyond mere survival now. They want to find new opportunities, find political involvement. And in other words, we are laying the groundwork for a sustainable democracy. This is because the middle class now intends to remain politically invested and look to prevent the return of dictatorship. In the case of the Philippines, after toppling Ferdinand Marcos's autocracy in 1986, they later voted to depose Corazon Aquino for attempting to change the constitution into democracy to keep him in power. This is the power of the middle class in mandating some kind of preservation of a democratic system. Contrast this to their side, where they want to expedite the process of putting in place a democracy. You get DR Congo, where the United States rushed to install a democracy, and Joseph Mobutu said, I'm going to steal money, I'm going to put in place a military dictatorship, because the people do not care and the people are not invested in the system because they're struggling for the scraps. In other words, this side of the House is proposing a system of international aid that does not help people at all, whereas the opposition says we want a system of giving aid to all countries that is one. They deserve it, because they should not be punished for the sins of their government, and second of all, because it's the way towards creating a truly sustainable democracy and truly sustainable change.
Ladies and gentlemen, Team New Zealand says that past behaviour is the best indicator for future behaviour.
So Team Singapore, standing on their crossed fingers and standing on the principal theory that checks and balances can work isn't enough, ladies and gentlemen. And we live in the real world where the reason dictatorships are such a bad problem is they don't want to be reasoned with. They don't let you check up on them, and they don't open their doors and their arms to let you check the books, ladies and gentlemen. That's why they're a dictatorship. So this whole case of Team Singapore falls down on this crucial point. But because we're in a debate, let's examine it in some more detail. So I'm going to examine why we should cut off all international aid to these dictatorships with 3 areas. Now the first is the moral justification of withholding this aid. The second will be, how does withholding this affect those people in those countries, the people on the ground that they've wanted to talk about so much. And then we'll lastly look at the idea about the international interaction which is going to accrue from this or not accrue. So now, this moral justification. Well, the first opposition we had to it was that it's just immoral to withhold this because people are starving. Well, we've got several responses to this, and the first is we don't reward murderers, we don't reward terrorists, and we don't reward those people who are on the largest scale, no thank you sir, oppressing their people. And it's what's even more immoral than withholding some aid, is it's more immoral to provide that 85% of aid which is going to be used to oppress them even more, ladies and gentlemen. If we want to do this on a utilitarian calculus, for every 1 bag of rice, no thank you sir, which trickles through the system, hundreds of millions of dollars of guns and army bases are built instead to further entrench that power. And we say that's the immorality of supporting this regime. So the second idea they had about the aid and the morality of it, I'll take in a moment sir, was about the fact no strings were attached.
If you steal $99 out of every $100 we give you, then by any yardstick we shouldn't be giving aid to this country based on the principle of corruption checks, which we have set up on first figure onwards.
We shouldn't be giving aid to these countries, is what we're saying, because they are corrupt and are steal it. And we gave the example of Somalia, and of Burma, and of Zimbabwe, all examples of where the aid is misused and misappropriated. So thanks for pointing that out for us. So in terms of strings being attached, the first thing the First Op told us was that we should give this aid with no requirements, with no conditions, with no strings attached. And we say that's morally wrong because we condone and we sponsor this regime. No, thank you, sir. But this idea of strings attached brings me into my second substantive, and that's about how this affects people on the ground. Now, they've told us that people will receive aid, and people do receive aid because we're going to check on them. But we need to examine this argument beyond the face value of how good it sounds. Now, they've said to us, first opposition admitted when we challenged him in a POI about the fact that in the past the reason aid doesn't work is because it gets misused. And he said, well, just because it hasn't worked in the past doesn't mean principally it can't work. Well, if it can't work because it hasn't worked in the past, well, then that's a reason to show you, no thank you, sir, that it's not going to go through. These dictatorships, they don't want to let you in and check up on them. They don't want to let you in and check the box and see what's going to happen and appropriate the spending. So this throwaway caveat they've carved out about, oh, but we're going to check where the money goes, just doesn't work. The nature of international aid is handing over the money and often handing over the food with all belief that it is going to go to the right place, and it doesn't, which is the very problem. So that's what we've been telling you about how people don't receive this aid. Our next opposition was the fact that if you withhold this aid, you deprive people of schools and you deprive people of hospitals. No, what you deprive people of is the government getting more guns. What you deprive people of is the government, no thank you, giving all the aid to those who only support them. Like in Zimbabwe, where you couldn't receive any food unless you supported Robert Mugabe. What it prevents people from is their military dictatorship building more compounds, like in Somalia or in Burma, taking all the aid from the UN, relabeling the boxes saying from the Burmese junta, and giving it only to the people who supported them. That's what we're depriving them of, ladies and gentlemen. We're depriving them of their regime being entrenched, and that's what Team Proposition is proud to, no thank you, stand for today. So in terms of how this affects the people on the ground, we are very proud to tell you we don't want to entrench that regime, which was my first speaker's substantive point. So now let's look at the international interaction which will accrue. Now what we've been told by Team Singapore is that the giving of aid and the trading of stuff promotes promotes friendliness and makes the dictators feel less threatened, makes them more inclined to open the doors of their huge military compounds and palaces and let you in to change things. So let's look at a case study. Ladies and gentlemen, North Korea has been a dictatorship since 1953, and in all those years, no thank you sir, we've made pretty much exactly zero progress. And how do we know that? Because every time we try to talk to North Korea, they just quit the six-party talks. Ladies and gentlemen, they quit the sunshine talks, they quit nuclear proliferation in terms of not doing it. And what they've been doing instead is testing nuclear bombs, ladies and gentlemen. So all this argumentation, I'll take you in a moment, sir, about, oh no, it actually wants to make them talk for us, empirically shows they don't.
If you've been reading the news, we actually got North Korea to dismantle one of its nuclear reactors through six-party talks because we were giving them aid.
No, they quit the six-party talks and they've been testing nuclear bombs, ladies and gentlemen. So we say that it's empirically untrue that dictators will want to talk. But secondly, we told you about how it actually strengthens international sanctions, and this was an interesting point because they came out and told us, but we don't like sanctions anyway, and we think they're wrong. But they also believe, no thank you sir, that we should use sanctions to help this aid be used in an appropriate way. So we should get arms embargoes and whatever else embargoes that they don't want to call sanctions, but will rename embargoes, to help their aid do the right thing. But they don't approve of sanctions. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the team has to make up their mind whether they propose or oppose withholding certain goods from a nation, because right now they're teetering on the thin edge of the wedge. So we've told you that sanctions are an incredibly good thing because they strengthen the international community's leverage to help make these dictators become weaker and do the kinds of things we want them to do. And we've heard no response to why this is such a bad thing. But the next substantive point we had under the international interaction was Maria's substantive point about how when aid is being given to dictatorial regimes which misuse this aid, the political capital, the political willingness from people in nations in a position to give aid goes down exponentially because they don't want to be part of a scheme which is supporting the regime of these people. We gave you the concrete example of Australia and how their aid budget declined exponentially when people thought they were supporting the Fijian dictatorship, and we're yet to hear a response to this. But in terms of further points, we told you how not giving this aid shows people in those nations we are denouncing that regime. And Maria also walked you through the example of Iran and the example of Cuba and how the people in those nations actually felt like the US was supporting their dictatorial regime. And so in terms of anti-Western sentiment, what breeds anti-Western sentiment is when those people relabel the boxes and oppress them. So in terms of, we say that principles, standing on principles just don't work, and we don't want to fund the further oppression of dictatorships.
Yes, dictators are evil. Yes, people are victims. Yes. But the question today isn't so much about how we deal with these evil men or these murderers, but what we do to their victims. Do we take away the schools and hospitals and roads they deserve? Or do we give them the schools, roads, and hospitals they need? Side opposition tells you we should never punish a person for their government sins, and thus we should continue to give aid to dictatorships. I'm going to ask you to do two comparisons in today's debate. The first comparison is between a world without a school and a world with a palace, and a school. The second comparison I'm going to ask you to make is between isolation, the case New Zealand has set up, and engagement, the case Team Singapore has set up. And I'm going to ask you to compare on these two routes, whether we help the victims of these dictators better or they do. And I'm going to tell you, Team Opposition does. So let's go into my first question. Which world is better, a world without a school, or a world with a bit of a palace and a bit of a school? Now we've told you, they told you dictators are going to steal everything. They're going to steal $99 out of $100 which you give them. And we've told you, well, it is so blatant that we won't give you any money because that's what we've told you from the start. That our criteria is corruption checks, something we should use in all aid nowadays. They've only ever criticized this very, very late in their third speaker by telling us it won't happen because. And we're going to tell you why it will happen. Because if we follow their logic that dictators are evil and greedy and want to steal aid, is it better to steal a little bit of aid at a time or to steal $99 out of $100 at once and then have your aid? Our side tells you if dictators are greedy, and they're smart about being greedy, they're not going to steal 99 out of $100. Maybe they're going to steal $1, $2, $3, no that can matter. And we've already told you right at the top of our first opposition speech that it doesn't matter if some of the money goes to a dictator, because we believe a world with a school is simply better than a world where the people get nothing at all, even if it means the dictator can add 1 or 2 wings to their palace. Now, they've told us that, okay, dictators are going to use the money they get to buy guns, no that can matter. We've told you, if that's your problem, do an arms embargo. They've told us, you can't do an arms embargo because, no that can matter, China and Russia will disagree. Firstly, we tell you that the solution is to pressure China and Russia, not cut off aid to dictatorships. And the second thing we're going to tell you is that if you can get China and Russia to stop giving aid to dictatorships, why can't you get them to have an arms embargo? We've said this from our second speaker onwards, and we've never come back to this. Now, the only real pertinent example that kept on hitting us over the head with was the Iranian Revolution. And so, somehow, because they used the aid to buy guns and train their army, they'll turn the world against the West. Well, that's not true. In the Iranian Revolution, we didn't just give the Shah of Iran aid, we actually gave him real weapons and helped to train his army. And this is what we stand for. We never said we wanted to prop up a dictatorship by training the army, so that's an extreme example which isn't in this debate. But the fundamental question, if you way around that, is which side best helps the people today? They've told us they're helping the people in the long term, and it's okay for them to suffer a bit in the short term. But how are you helping the people in the long term if you're not going to do anything about the problem but just sit there, twiddle your thumbs and hope something happens? Yes, ma'am?
Given we can still get aid to these people through things like airdrops and independent NGOs, why don't you do it your way and we pop up
Madam,
dictators?
firstly, most aid comes from government, so we're doing it through NGOs who are already cutting off the amount of aid. And if you're going to drop aid into the middle of a country controlled by a dictator, then I think he's going to steal it if you don't think so. At least in our case, we have the ability to put in checks. They told us that our policy is immoral because we're rewarding murderers. But we've told you, your policy is even more immoral because you're harming their victims more. Our side says, okay, we admit that maybe the dictator gets some benefit out of this. But isn't it more important to care about the people who are still suffering than justice is done to the person who has committed the evil? Because we should elevate suffering whenever we can. And this is the case we brought before the House today. The next thing they told us under this point is that aid should only ever be given to places where it is the most effective. Now let's take this principle to its logical conclusion. By their logic, we should only ever give aid to places which can use the aid well. So the vast majority of aid will only ever go to first world nations, because it's in first world nations that aid can be maximized because we have the proper corruption checks and infrastructures in the same place. Our side tells you aid just isn't necessarily about putting in places where it can be used most effectively. Sometimes it's about giving it to the people who deserve the aid the most. And the people living under an oppressive regime certainly deserve the aid simply because of the conditions that they have been living in. And this is something that you, Madam, Team New Zealand, forget. Our side has told you that even if you want to talk about long-term change, the school is the object that provides the long-term change because it sets the grounds for fundamental democracy to be set up later down the road. We've told you this in our second speaker's point of substantive, and they haven't responded to it, so we think this point stands. Let's go on to my next comparison, but before that, yes, madam.
Okay, so given you've conceded that there's always going to be some level of corruption, but at the same time, the condition of your counter model is there is no corruption. Exactly which
Madam, the condition of our counter models, there can't be excessive amounts of corruption. If you steal like 85% of the aid, like you said Somalia does, then we'd stop giving aid to you. But if you steal 20%, 30%, and the rest of it still goes to the people and builds the schools that they need, we are fine with that. We said that from our first speaker onwards, it's clear you've completely misunderstood our case. Let's go on and ask a second comparison. Which is the better solution to the problem? Isolation or engagement? Now, the only thing we have to ask under this is, what would New Zealand do to the governments who are continually oppressing their people? They would do nothing. They said, we're going to condemn you, we are going to sanction you. And for the record, we've only ever opposed economic sanctions because it is economic sanctions that hurt the people. We have not opposed other forms of sanctions that hurt the government. They've told you that their sanctions are going to work. And if you think about it for a moment, the only difference between our policy and theirs is that they have the economic sanctions which hurt the people the most. And given that the dictatorship doesn't really care about its people, what incentive will it have to change? The sanctions are targeting the wrong people, they're targeting the people of the country who will suffer, and something the dictatorship won't care at all about. No thank you, sir. We've told you our aid gives us leverage to bring a dictatorship to the negotiating table. We've given you the examples of North Korea and Myanmar, and you told us North Korea didn't exactly do much in the six-party talks. Well, firstly, that's not true. They actually dismantled the nuclear reactors with which they've been building nuclear bombs, thus averting potential nuclear war. And even if we accepted that in their case, the governments don't do anything at all in the talks, at least we brought them to the negotiating table, and at least we have an avenue of change, which is one more avenue than Team New Zealand provide, because all their case has been about is condemning the government without ever trying to make the government change. Team Singapore wants to change the government. That's why we stand for the principle of engagement. We stand for the principle of engagement because changing the government is the best way forward for the people of the nation. So what has my team shown you today? We've shown you firstly it's completely and utterly immoral to punish the people for the sins of the government. We've shown you that engagement and not isolation is the answer if we really want democracy to flourish in the dictatorships of today. And last but not least, we've shown you at the very least we get some money to the people who need it most, and for these reasons, go with Team Opposition.
I tell you, it's not hard to choose the case of Team Opposition today. It's not hard because we fought for human life and human dignity. It's not hard because we stood up here and told you aid was meant to help the people, not to punish a government. It's not hard because we believe in democracy and we have given you the best means to creating stable democracies in nations not lucky enough to have this already. None of this can happen in the world of the proposition. The world of the proposition is the world of the sick child who can't get to a hospital because there was no developmental aid to build one. The world of the proposition is of the uneducated adult who is oppressed because he never got the school that we could build with developmental aid. Their world is one of aid denied. We've asked them, do they really want these consequences? And they never really gave us a rebuttal. They told us it's okay. Until our third speech, when they finally said, we're going to airdrop aid in. Right. We're going to airdrop a school, are we? Or a hospital? Ladies and gentlemen, they don't care about the people living in these countries, and their policy reflects that. They tell us, we want to prevent a stronger dictatorship. And they would do that by fueling the rhetoric of this dictatorship. They would do that by turning the whole nation against the people who are trying to help them, the developed world. That doesn't make any sense. They tell us dictatorships are going to use this money to buy weapons. We told you no. We can have an arms embargo. We told you we've only been against economic sanctions and not other sanctions that cripples the government's ability to hurt its people. They told us about moral abhorrence. This is ironic, because what's really more morally abhorrent? Denying the aid that could make a difference, or doing our best to get as much of it in as possible? They've talked to us about bringing better international relations, and their solution to this, better international relations, is not to talk to the people that we don't like. We tell you isolationism is not the policy we can adopt here, because it makes the dictator more afraid, and it prevents him from making any kind of constructive change that betters his nation. So we tell you the world of the opposition is a dark world and we would avoid it at all costs. So what then is the world of my side of the house? We fight corruption because we have checks in place. We asked them what's wrong with these checks, and they just said, well, they didn't work in Somalia. Ladies and gentlemen, where was the reason for why these checks will fail again and again and again? It was never present. It was a static response on the side of the proposition. We told you that corruption checks is standard operating procedure with aid, so they can't force unconditional aid on us. We told you about protecting the people, that individuals shouldn't be punished twice, first by having to live in a dictatorship, and then by being denied aid. We told you about the engagement and the calculus of the dictator, and how we don't want this dictator to withdraw and do it himself. We want engagement where he makes things better. And lastly, we told you about creating a stable democracy, because we engender a middle class, a new democracy with stronger fundamentals than they can ever have. If you believe in creating good democracy, if you believe that aid is meant to help people, and if you believe that the side of the proposition cannot truly help people, then you must go with the opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, on side proposition, we had to show you why it was bad to reward dictatorships for the horrors that they proliferate. The opposition had to tell us why they would give aid that we could otherwise give to those people who are suffering in other nations, to people like Robert Mugabe, to Kim Jong-il, and to the Burmese junta. Today's debate has come down to 4 main points of contention. Firstly, does this strengthen or weaken dictatorships? Second, does this harm or help the individual? And third, is this an effective thing for the international community to do? Finally, is this the right thing to do morally? So firstly, does this weaken or strengthen dictatorship? And you may have noticed that Singapore didn't really want to talk about this. Singapore, in fact, conceded that aid would be misappropriated, that aid would give governments material support for the horrible oppression that they do, that aid would, in fact, give government political support, because, as I said at first, and was never responded to, they are able to force people to support them in exchange for aid, and furthermore can rebrand it to use as propaganda. That was never responded to. And ladies and gentlemen, they didn't want to talk about this idea of what strengthened or weakened dictatorships at all, except to use their universal response to everything: we can put in checks and balances, which was what they said to every single thing in today's debate, but never substantiated. The second issue of today's debate was, how does this help the individual? We told you that by the very nature, dictatorships are corrupt. What aid actually does is not to help people, but to strengthen the oppression against them and provide an incentive for dictatorships to treat them badly in exchange for needing more aid and to help them in return. And the universal response was, once again, we can put in checks and balances, ladies and gentlemen. But let me explain to you precisely why. Throughout our team's case, we told you these checks and balances would not work. Because, ladies and gentlemen, we don't live in a dream world called Singapore, we live in the real world. We live in a world where Russia and China are not going to stop selling arms, where a black market still exists, where there is no way for us to impose these conditions in dictatorships which will never accept aid with these conditions, and in which, if we impose their condition of not corruption, no one will get aid, ladies and gentlemen, because all these dictatorships are in fact corrupt. They have not lived in the real world. Their entire premise upon which they base their entire case, hence, falls. But furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, we told you that to give aid to dictatorships, you have to take it away from others, and in fact, to make it less valuable to give aid. And we say that is hugely harmful to everyone, ladies and gentlemen. They never told us a good response to this, except to say everyone who suffers is in a dictatorship. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is false. They just show us why it's preferable to give this aid to dictatorships than to people who suffer in democracies. And furthermore, we told you that what is more important is the issue of whether or not in the long term we will get a democracy. Because people see their freedom, as evidenced by revolution, more important than their short-term well-being. So finally, we had this idea of what is the moral and effective thing for the international community to do. And we told you how this provides incentives for moderatism. We told you how it strengthens the effectiveness for sanctions, which apparently Singapore opposes despite their almost universal use. We told you how people can otherwise leave the table because they already have their minimum requirements for supporting the government. We told you how it means that we don't recognize the validity of these governments. And we told you how it leads to long-term resentment, like we saw in Cuba with Batista and in Iran. And what did they tell us? They tell us that we only get a stable democracy through other means which only work when we're in a democracy to start with. They told us that people have a moral right to aid, even though they take it away from corrupt nations. Ladies and gentlemen, they were inconsistent. They lose the moral argument. They lose the international relations argument. We win the dictatorships argument. We win the individual rights argument. Today's debate falls to side proposition.
It's lovely that we're judging, and you watch and we judge an amazing debate in a very historical site, which reflects democracy in my country. And I'm so proud that for Greece this dream has become true, and we've managed to organize this championships. I hope you're all very much, I hope you all like the championship so far, and it's really great watching amazing debates, and this debate was indeed amazing, and I think both teams deserve a round of applause. As you might have imagined, this decision was a very difficult decision to be taken. It was not a unanimous decision, far from that. It was a split decision, 3-2. And essentially, the adjudicators of this panel did not agree on which team clashed better the arguments of the other team. It's tough. So three of the adjudicators, and I'll try to leave it as vague, and we'll be glad to give you feedback on the specifics. Three of the adjudicators believe that the arguments were better clashed and awarded this debate to Team Proposition,